dinner and your dialogue. I know at our table we solved all the problems in the world in the past half hour. I hope you can too at your table. So it's my pleasure now to bring up Ann Graham, who's a Dialogue Institute Advisory Board member, to tell you more about donations and the silent auction. Come on up, Ann.
On education that changes the world, and dialogue, talking with other people, no matter how different from you they may be, is what will build bonds of peace in this world. And if you're here and you'd like to support the Dialogue Institute, on your table, there's an envelope that looks like this, and you can either put a check in there or as a nod to moving into the currency grid, there's a barcode you can scan, just like this. So please help us continue this very valuable work of dialogue. Thanks.
Thank you, Ann, and don't forget the silent auction is still open, so this would be a good time to go outbid your neighbor and get one of those beautiful rolls or plates that you had your eye on. Now I'd like to invite Dr. James Puglisi to the stage to introduce our keynote speaker. Dr. Puglisi is a Dialogue Institute Advisory Board member. I'll turn it over to you.
Good evening. Assalamu alaikum. I'm honored to have the task of providing an introduction for our keynote speaker, Dr. John Esposito, who, in my opinion, as a Roman Catholic lay minister, is a rock star in the study of interfaith and dialogue and religious studies, and particularly looking at the world of Islam and the community there. As a Roman Catholic, I was first introduced to the idea of interfaith dialogue while a graduate theology student at Will and Jesuit University, where I was introduced to the landmark Catholic document Nostra Aetate, which means in our time, which is the first two words of the document. It's a Catholic faith. This document came out of the Vatican II Council held in the early 1960s. A council that was wrestling with what it meant to be a Catholic church in response to the horrors of the Holocaust, as well as how the church would move from its historic tendency of religious isolation to one of engagement as part of the global community. There are few minds in the Catholic tradition that have been as active and prolific in expanding the religious literacy of the Catholic Church, but also so many others across the globe, literally, than Dr. John Esposito. If I read his complete bio, it would most likely take longer than the presentation he's going to give you.
Take your time.
Yes. He also said if I talk long, he'll talk short. If I talk short, he'll talk long. He caught a break in that I was using the same bio as the person doing your program. So much of what I was going to say, you can read for yourself now. As you look down through the titles and the various awards and exposure that he has had, both in the United States and across the world, and you look at the titles, you'll know that they are not about dogmatic discussions between theologians, but it's a look at the world and how people engage each other and how people engage in relationships across our different religious traditions. He's a person of the people, a person trying to help us navigate a very complex, diverse pluralistic, and wonderfully created world by our Creator God. So I really encourage you to look at that list. I won't read it now like I was going to. I first met Dr. Esposito when we were privileged to host him as our guest speaker for the Nostra Aetate election when I worked at St. Edward's University. After the lecture, our committee treated him to a dinner afterwards. My memory of that dinner was not one of theological discussions, although I'm sure there was some of that. We ended up talking about our pets, our cats and our dogs. And I remember him describing that despite the cold weather, he would, when it was time to walk the dog, whether he was wearing walking shorts or pants or whatever, he would just get on his slippers, put on his trench coat, and walk into the wintry weather of Washington, D.C., while everyone around him was dressed in parkas and boots and hoods doing the same thing. It's a Brooklyn, New York thing. It's who he is. It reminded me of my own dad, who would have done something very similar. I tell that story because while he is this brilliant prolific scholar, he is a genuine human person, still in touch with his shared humanity. He shares a similar immigrant-rooted history in the United States, such as my own Sicilian-born grandparents who immigrated here many years ago, and many of you also are immigrants in this country. We all share a similar story. He makes you feel at home with him. I think that is reflected in the core of his writings. A pursuit of exploring, understanding, and bridging the lived life of people as we move individually and corporately through a religiously pluralistic world. Having served as the keynote speaker for the very first Friendship and Dialogue dinner, I can't think of someone better to return to our podium on this 20th anniversary of the Friendship and Dialogue dinner. May I present to you Dr. John Esposito.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I was thinking when I was sitting at the table a number of years ago, I was invited to Mexico to speak at an international conference for scientists. And I thought I was coming there to talk about Islam and its relationship to science or whatever. But instead, what they told me was at the last minute that I was going to be debating scientists with regard to the existence of God. And the way they would do the program is they would shut all the lights off. They had thousands of people there. And then they would start to put the lights on, and you had to run up on the stage, and they would play a theme song. And for me, it was the theme from Rocky. But today, I was watching the opening, and the music is from Beethoven's Five Secrets. And I'm very emotional about that. As you can see that. But you really have to listen to that by the piano guys. You can get it, on the internet. Beethoven says something like, it's a line that sort of talks about the music and the extent to which you can feel it, you can touch God. And it goes right through you. Anyway, I wanted to reassure you that I know that most of you are sitting there thinking, I wonder how long this is going to be. And in about 10 minutes, you'll be thinking even more. I'll be close to the end. I can't guarantee that. What I want to do today, and I'm probably going to look at my notes more than I normally do, because I want to lead you down a lane to understand just how important what the Dialogue Institute does, how important it was when they did it after 9/11, but how important it remains. When I first came here 20 years ago, I was very impressed at how they were established and they were running programs. But when I left, I thought, okay, you've got people that are really committed. The question was, will you be able to pull the community in? Because that's always the challenge when you do program. Not just pulling in, as it were, your family, as it were, your broader family, religiously or culturally, but the broader community. And when I came down tonight, I thought, what the hell is going on down here? I didn't realize it was all of you. I heard this huge crowd, with all this. To turn out this kind of audience is absolutely remarkable. And it says something about what they've accomplished, let alone in my conversations today, about the other dialogue institutes that have been created in different places. Let me just begin briefly by telling you who I am so you know where I'm coming from on this. I was born and raised in Brooklyn. I'm Italian American, that's part of my identity. I was a Capuchin Franciscan. I went in at 14, left at 24. Been married 57 years. If you start computing, you can get into what my age is. And I turn 99 next year, so a little much to be excited about. I had no interest in Islam. I was trained to be a Catholic theologian at the time of Vatican II. I taught Catholic theology. I went to Temple University to do a PhD. I wanted to get a PhD in Catholicism, but not go to a Catholic university because I had all this Catholic education. And I never wound up taking a course in Catholicism because you had to take a course in world religions. And no, I did not get interested in Islam. I got interested in Hinduism and Zen Buddhism. When I was ready to write a dissertation in Hinduism, the chairman of the department encouraged me. He said, the last scholar that we are getting, the interesting thing about the department was covering the world's religions. So you had different religions, and they were hiring a Muslim, Ismail al-Faruqi, a Palestinian Muslim. He said, you really should do something with him. I knew nothing about Islam or Muslims. I had seen the movie The Exodus, and if you saw the movie The Exodus, you would not exactly feel that you needed to hang out with Arabs or Muslims. And so I kept declining. The chair was very strong in suggesting it. I was married and realized that I needed to get out of the program. So I went and I offered to take the course. The person who was my mentor, Ismail al-Faruqi, said, let's plan your courses. I said, why would I plan courses? He said, so you could major in Islam. Why would I major in Islam? I'm not going to do it. About a month and a half later, he called me in to study Arabic. He said, fill out an application to go to the University of Pennsylvania because you can get a scholarship and study here in the summer. I said, why did I study Arabic? He said, because then if you have Arabic, you can get your PhD in Islamic studies. I said, but I'm not doing it. He said, sit down and sign. And I was married and I thought I don't want to fail the course. So, and then the rest became history. Now, why I went into that field makes no sense to me because I talked my brother and his wife years ago out of their PhD program in philosophy because there were no jobs. There were no jobs when I finished my degree in the mid-70s to teach Islam. I didn't teach Islam, I taught world religions. And I didn't teach Islam until the Iranian Revolution. I couldn't publish books, nobody invited me to talk. That was going to be my career. And then the Iranian Revolution came. I owe my career and my first Lexus to Ayatollah Khomeini. I went from an old Toyota to a Lexus like that. So the idea that that would happen, okay, the only problem with that is that for most Americans, their engagement, they were Muslims in America, but they were invisible because they would have been identified as Egyptian or Lebanese, etc. But not that they were Muslim. I was raised in New York. There were no mosques that I ever remember seeing. Mosques were relatively invisible. The oldest mosques in the United States were in Iowa and not in Boston. The Boston Mosque was actually outside of Boston. So there was no sense. So for most people, the engagement with Islam was putting on the TV and seeing people chanting death to America every day. And then also that the news program at night, which was about, America held hostage, as it were. It was that set the tones for many people. And to the extent of its invisibility, Islam was not present in most educational institutions, primary schools, secondary schools, or even universities. Most people who taught Islam, I think I was the first person to get a PhD in a religion department in Islam. Okay. Diplomats who were going overseas were not trained to understand the religion and culture. Military were not trained. The two major professional organizations, the Middle East Studies Association and the American Academy of Religion, had virtually no coverage. The American Academy of Religion sees itself as the Academy of Religion, but it was Protestants, Catholics, and Jews. And so it took a number of years to actually demonstrate that you could have an audience that would actually come and want to see Islam. So against that background, and media had no coverage. Then the media that you were exposed to was the Iranian Revolution. And I can remember, I was among the first academics to go into Iran after it. And, you know, the images were there. You walked into a hotel, and the question was, were you going to step on the American flag? You know, that was marked up. You had pictures of Ayatollah Khomeini, you know, etc. I met with Khomeini's family, and the young guys that brought me there were all laughing, and I was talking to his daughter. And I had, in those days, for about 25 years, I had quite a big beard and long hair. And I had taken my beard off. And so they showed it, and she said, why did you take your beard off? And her face was covered. And I said, you know, I always wanted a beard. I'd grown up when I was a Franciscan. I said, but I'm getting older, and your beard becomes white. And I was making this all up. And she said, I like men with beards. And when she said it, I looked over her, and she had a huge picture of her father. And I thought, oh my God. And I broke into such a sweat that she could see it. It was so visible. So she moved it away and smiled at me. But for Americans, people just had no sense. American diplomats, the Foreign Service Institute, did not really develop programs. And I worked with the person that developed it until 1984, 1985. That was years after. So against that background, to then have 9/11 was inconceivable. You know, this was the major attack on the United States. And what happened with that, and then the kind of media coverage that followed that. What I want to do is walk you down the lane in terms of that post-period and how we get here. And I'll do it as briefly as I can. Just take this paperclip off. All right. In the 1990s, you began to see, in light of the Iranian Revolution, debates about and talk about whether or not Islam was a danger. And you had a famous piece written called The Clash of Civilizations, which became an instant global to read all over the world. I was involved in a debate in Saudi Arabia with Sam Huntington, the guy that wrote it. But I remember after that, I'd have Muslim friends in Malaysia, Pakistan, write to me and say, can you get Huntington to come here? You know, can you get him? I mean, and Huntington would say that he was a very famous professor at Harvard, had been in government, and published all over, but this was the book. And that phrase, Clash of Civilizations, existed today, even though at times it doesn't mean exactly what he was saying. But what he was saying at that time was that there was a very good chance that there would be a clash between Islam and the West. And he put it that way. He didn't just say between some Muslim countries in the West. In his article, he said, Islam has bloody borders. Not Muslim countries have bloody borders. But if you did say that, you'd be saying, yeah, Muslims are fighting Muslims in Egypt, Syria, Sudan, which would show it's not religious what was going on. In his book, he said, not only does Islam have bloody borders, Islam has bloody innards, meaning the religion itself has bloody innards. And I did a TV program in Washington, and I and the moderator asked him why he said that, and he let that go. As a result of that notion of clash, in the subsequent years, you had the leading up to 9/11, you had the portrayal of Islam by authors as a triple threat. A political threat, a military threat, and a demographic threat. The demographic threat with the phrase, the Muslims are coming, the Muslims are coming. Okay? Now, the reason I'm familiar with that phrase is that I wrote a book at that time called The Islamic Threat, Myth or Reality. The whole notion was that with the end of the Cold War and in light of the First Gulf War, there was a chance that Islam would be seen as the next global threat. And I remember going to the State Department to brief the Secretary for, I think it was Human Rights, I forget now. And the first thing he said to me that you had elections in Algeria and Islamic movement was winning in the elections. And they were not extremists at that point at all. But he was asking, is it another Iran? And I was saying, there's a hell of a difference between Algeria and Iran. And I said, are you thinking that Islam is going to be a global threat? And he said, no. But then later he said, but actually it's the only global ideological alternative. So the idea that suddenly the awareness of Muslims, which you didn't know anything about, many people wouldn't have known how many Muslims there were. Suddenly one became aware of the fact that you had all of these countries that were Muslim, and you had this huge population that was Muslim. And so that notion laid the background and was picked up by media in America, media in Europe. So that when 9/11 came, this really put things over the top in terms of the kind of coverage and the way Islam was portrayed. One need only remember what happened at that time. I was asked to do an interview on Fox, and the journalist who was doing it was a young journalist, blonde. I describe her as blonde because my wife's blonde, and my mother used to say that when I used to wear a Roman collar, I would always still turn to look at blonde when she walked by. So when I brought my wife home, my mother just thought, that's it, it's logical. But she's just a nice person. The president had just been speaking, and a senior military. And so I started to talk about the Muslim world and the issue of Muslim, Muslim-West relations, etc. And she said, are you deaf? And this was live, and I just looked at it. She said, did you hear what they just said? This is a global war on terrorism. In other words, taking it literally, this is a global war on terrorism. Terrorism is all over the world, and we're going to fight it all over the world. Interestingly enough, I did a program in Britain for the equivalent, like, military side of things. And in that off-the-record section, the fellow who ran it said the one thing that he regretted was that Bush and Blair used that phrase, that it was a global war against terrorism, because that stuck there. The idea that instead of you've got today close to 2 billion Muslims. Back then it would have been maybe 1.5 billion Muslims. And maybe 1% or 0.5% of these really deadly terrorists exist, but the vast majority of Muslims and their religion is something else. That was lost in most conversations. And that's what fed the growth of Islamophobia. Islamophobia is an exaggerated fear and portrayal of Islam that can lead to hate speech, but also hate crimes, violence, and unwarranted imprisonment. So to give you an example of what I'm talking about here, in terms of statistics, in the first 2 years after 9/11, and these statistics come from, at times I'm going to refer to a reference, because if I'm going to say something, I want you to know it's not just my opinion, it comes from other people, and there's data for this. David Cole wrote an incredible book called Less Safe, Less Free, and it's a great read. To have a lawyer or a scholar write a book that's very readable can be a little rare. And his book is just terrific. What did he point out? In the first 2 years after 9/11, the United States locked up over 5,000 foreign nationals in preventive detention. In the first 2 years. After that, it sought 8,000 Arab and Muslim men for FBI interviews. Not because they'd necessarily done anything, but they came in. 80,000 Arabs and Muslim foreign nationals for special registration, fingerprinting, and photographing. The idea was to find the terrorists in our midst. The phrase was embedded cells. Not one of these people, in fact, it's not one of these men, it's interesting, they were all men, boy. Not one of these men, up to that time, had been found guilty of anything. None of these people. But we were able, under the new ways in which we dealt with things, to bring people in even when we didn't have evidence that they had done anything. Now, that's not to say that we haven't had a problem with some homegrown terrorists, in the United States. But in terms of thousands and thousands of people being brought in, I spoke to a group of businessmen and I said, that's like doing what we did to the Japanese, potentially. To which I heard 3 people say, and it worked. It was, but that's the mentality that we were, that we were developing. And that allowed us, for example, when it came to Iraq, and we couldn't find weapons of mass destruction, to basically wind up talking about the fact that it was necessary to get Saddam Hussein out in the name of democracy. And how did George W. Bush legitimate it? Now, there are parts of George W. Bush that I can't quite get that far. Okay. Anyway, I got distracted with that. Yeah. Okay. So, what I did like was that he did say to people, it's not the religion of Islam. But on the other hand, he would then say things like, what do they hate? They hate who we are. Our democracy, well, who are they? When you're doing the they. He didn't say those terrorists, but not all of those Muslims. And so when we couldn't find weapons of mass destruction, it became the promotion of democracy that justified going in to take Saddam out. But it also justified the occupation for several years. And the irony about that is that Bush quite rightly did say, and this is important for what's going on today in terms of American policy, Bush did say that the United States had practiced democratic exceptionalism. That is, that he, in his first term, and presidents before him, Democrat and Republican, while promoting democracy in the world, as saying it, practiced democratic exceptionalism when it came to the Muslim world. In other words, authoritarian rulers, we could accept them because it fit our domestic policies, our international policies. That has had repercussions down through the years, including the Arab Spring, the overthrow of the governments in the region, but then the pulling back. Obama himself refused to call a coup. It was a military coup. So the implications for that, were there. Now, there were responses to this danger. 3 in particular I'll refer to because they were significant responses, but also because I know something about it because I was involved in it. One was in 2004, when for the first time you had the Secretary General Kofi Annan basically giving an address on Islamophobia. There was no massive public talk about Islamophobia to the extent that in this speech, in which he said, some claim that Islam is incompatible with democracy or irrevocably hostile to modernity and the rights of women. And in too many circles, disparaging remarks about Muslims are allowed to pass without censure, with the result that prejudice acquires a veneer of acceptability. Ironically, only a few years ago, Baroness Warsi of the House of Lords in the UK said, both in the UK and in a speech at Georgetown, that in the UK, Islamophobia had become accepted dinner talk. So you could engage in an Islamophobic conversation of prejudice, etc. Thank you. Oh no, it's supposed to be Bombay Sapphire. But the fact is that Baroness Warsi could say that within the society, and that is a problem that the Brits have had if you follow what's going on in the UK. The year later, Kofi Annan and the UN created the Alliance of Civilizations. Why the Alliance of Civilizations? The whole idea was people think there's a clash of civilizations. We need to address the clash of civilizations, so they created an alliance of civilizations. And there were about 12 of us involved. It included Archbishop Desmond Tutu from South Africa, but also former foreign ministers, etc. The alliance existed today, running conferences in many parts of the world, dealing with and reaching out to policymakers, but also to youth, to deal with this whole question of, are we talking about a clash of civilizations? What does that mean to think in terms of clash of civilizations? It's one thing if you talk about there's a clash in a restricted way, but if you say it's a clash of civilizations, it really means one side against the other, the whole side. So there's a clash between the West and Islam. I mean, that kind of generalization, which therefore means everybody gets brushstroke. If you're an Italian American, you know what it is to be brushstroked in terms of mafia. When I was in the monastery and even after, people who were not Italian would always talk to me as if I had an inside track on the mafia. I was in a meeting in Qatar with diplomats from all over the world, but particularly with a group of Americans and Brits. And we were talking about a plan that we had that we needed to implement and back home in the US and also overseas. And so different people were saying, well, I think I have this influence or that. And then there was a group that they didn't think we could get to. And I said, don't worry, my cousin Guido can take care of it. Well, half of the audience thought it was a joke. I could see in the eyes of others, they thought I had a cousin Guido. And I still use that in situations because I will now say that my cousin Guido says, because I always say if I don't like somebody, we'll take him out and break his legs. I will now say, my cousin Guido says, hey Johnny, why break his legs? The Pope's excommunicated us. Either one is a mortal sin. So why don't I just kill him? Then we take care of the problem. But this stereotyping of Islam and Muslims is so absolutely common that I've been in conversations where people say things that you would never say about anybody else. I'm talking about leading you through the years. Things are getting better, but they're also getting worse. That'll be my conclusion. And I'll try to demonstrate that. And then finally, the World Economic Forum set up a council of 100 leaders, religious leaders, political leaders, I mean, you name it. And the whole purpose was, for a number of years, to run major events there and then carry it out of leaders that were going to be dealing with, again, moving beyond the notion of clash. Obviously, for the World Economic Forum, it has to do with international trade, international politics, etc. But all of those things are out there. And then you have, in 2010, for the first time in U.S. history, a major publication, Time Magazine, having a cover that said, is America Islamophobic? On the cover. CNN immediately picked up on it. They weren't used to it. I got flown into New York to do a whole segment of segments because they weren't even used to that kind of issue. Why? Because if you read the article, what they concluded was yes. And they gave examples. They went out and did, research in different, areas. I mean, you had sad stories like, and I've known these cases. You'd be in the Midwest, you'd have a physician who was a Muslim and very popular in the community. Got along with everybody. And then at a certain point, some of the Muslims decided they wanted to build a small mosque. No. Several years ago, you had the mayor of a former mayor of a New Jersey city, not Jersey City, but of a city in New Jersey, who was very popular. And he and some friends, it took them several years to build a mosque in his city. So he was okay, but the idea of a mosque was a symbol of something that people didn't want. And so we had instances after 9/11 across the country of mosques being attacked, of Muslims. Right after 9/11, I flew to LA. I canceled the trip initially because it was right after 9/11. I figured they didn't want to have it. And the Muslim community said, please come, because if you don't come, it'll reinforce for people the issue. So I get there and I'm waiting for the car to pick me up. And a car goes by and on the back it says, kill them all and let Allah decide. And this kind of thing could easily be done in those days, in public. Hold on, I'll be finishing very soon. And I often used to say this, I haven't said it in years, but I will introduce this. I'm looking at an audience, and at the end of my talk, I will come back into the audience and pick out 3 people who I think have paid the most attention and kept their eyes on me. I will lay my hands on them and cure them of any disease that they have. And I'm serious. If you don't have a disease, take it as a chip. 10 years from now, you have a disease, say my name, and you will be cured. Okay? Let's take a look at what data tells us about American Muslims. And one of the things that Dadi Mogahed of Gallup and I did, Gallup did several years of looking at 35 Muslim countries and interviewed people in every part of the country, remote villages, etc., in local languages, not calling them up. And we did a book called Who Speaks for Islam? Would a Billion Muslims Really Think? And what did the data really tell us? Well, in contrast to polls of Americans at that time, who were asked what they thought about Muslims, you had 57% of Americans, when asked what they most admired about Muslim societies, offered 2 responses: nothing or I don't know. 33% disclosed that they believed that Muslim Americans were more sympathetic to terrorists. 60% said they had negative feelings towards Muslims. Less than half thought U.S. Muslims could be loyal citizens. Many thought that they should have special IDs. But what could we say about the Muslim community at that time? From data that came from Gallup and also others. They come from far more than 68 or 70 countries, many of them. They're second, third generation. They're integrated educationally, economically, and increasingly politically. They span the socioeconomic spectrum, now members of Congress, businessmen, lawyers, also cab drivers. After 9/11, I used to do car service, and it was called, what was it called? It had a phrase, and I never thought of it as being necessarily Islamic, you know? But yet all the drivers were Muslim. But I never thought of it, that was anything. But after 9/11, they changed their name. Maybe they had something like Green such and such before that. But they, you know, they changed their name. Educationally, Muslims are second to American Jews in terms of education. And significantly, Muslim women are as educated as Muslim men, sometimes more educated. All of that in stark contrast to what popular media was saying about it. 40%, and this was a number of years ago, had college degrees versus other Americans, 29%. 31% were full-time students compared to 10% of the general population. Regarding religion, 77% of Muslims surveyed said they worship the same God as Christians and Jews. 84% said Muslims should strongly emphasize shared values. This is where Dialogue Institute and Dialogue Institutes become critical. And I'll come back to that in a second. Let me move beyond this because I see some people are restless. No, the problem that we ran into is the failure to distinguish between the faith and the values of the vast majority of Muslims. What I'm saying sounds like a no-brainer, okay? We fail to distinguish between the faith and values of the vast majority, and we equate them with the hijacking of religion by a terrorist minority. And that generalization just takes traction. And in the end, I'll tell you, it's becoming worse globally. I'm working with a colleague, Oxford will be bringing out a book on global Islamophobia and populism. It's actually getting worse at a global scale. So what can we say about American Muslims in very recent years? Well, ISPU which is a research institute for social policy and understanding. Dali Magahed is the head of the research, former Gallup leader. They survey, and my center sometimes has been associated with the survey that is helping to fund it. They surveyed Muslims, Jews, Protestants, and Catholics to examine their attitudes on various issues from politics and religion to violence and identity. What emerged from the results is a profile of a Muslim community that emphasizes the economy, Islamophobia, and education as important priorities. A significant number of Muslims, actually Muslims are more optimistic than any other religious group about America. Okay, clearly that's a cut of Muslims. For example, if you were to talk about African American Muslims, not all, but many, they're in a different socioeconomic status. But Muslims are, despite the fact that they identify discrimination more than 50% that they've experienced or that friends have, and that they're particularly worried about their kids being bullied in school, regularly being bullied, sometimes every day. And the reality is still there. Just the other day we had an alert. Georgetown, we get these alerts when anything happens on the campus or near the campus. Usually if somebody's been stopped or robbed or whatever. And it was a group of young students walking, one or more women wearing the hijab, and people, guys shouting, physically grabbing them, etc. These things still happen and can happen in the heart of Georgetown, on M Street, or any place in the country. When Muslims are asked about what's important to them and why they vote, they see it as a civic duty, they want to make a difference, and they want to make sure that their vote counts. I must say, the Muslim vote has increased significantly, but it's still lower than most other groups. But it's increased significantly, and hopefully in the vote in Georgia, that's happening too. So Muslims are as likely as Protestants to have a strong sense of American identity, and percentage-wise, as likely as conservative Protestants in terms of faith being important to them, going to mosque regularly being important to them. That profile becomes very important. They are as likely as other Americans to identify strongly with their faith. 89% of Muslims, then 84% of Jews, and at least 95% of Catholics and Protestants. Okay? Parentheses. From my point of view personally, Catholics have swung too many of them to the right. It used to be that if you looked up the Christian right on Wikipedia or whatever, it was Protestant groups that were there. Now, a very significant number of Catholics are there. And for me, that is an issue. I didn't intend to say it, but it came out. We'll wipe that out, edit that out. Muslims are engaged in their communities to a significant degree. 38% in terms of when we look at it, Jews 40%, Catholics 42%. We're still ahead. Okay, this is all ironic when I kid this way, because the issue I've always had is people who attack me all the time because they say that I'm a Muslim. And Muslims who hate that I am a Muslim. And I was in a private meeting with European and American diplomats in the UAE, but in a remote area. And I had spoken, and then there was a panel at the end, and like you, I was getting restless, and I was the last speaker. The guy before me, if I mentioned his name, you would know it. Very prominent and really great speaker, Muslim speaker from the West Coast. I'll get close and throw out the university, and then you can run and look him up. He went on and on and on, and I thought, I'm not going to say anything. So I just said, I'm not going to say anything, but because this is off the record and it's closed, and I know I can do it, I'm going to answer a question that has been raised about me for the last 40 years. And I said, it's difficult, but I know you'll stay in this room. And I said, it's true. And I waited for about 3 minutes, and I went like this, and I said, Yeah, it's absolutely true. I may as well say it now. I do dye my hair. Okay? The young Muslims came to me and they said, they were all going, mashallah, mashallah, mashallah. They said, you're really disappointed. The Europeans were looking at me like, what's he been drinking? I mean, they just had like no idea where the hell I came from. Okay, so I want to bring this to a close, the way forward. That was the worst part of doing this, to talk about the way forward. I used to be able to do it easily, but things are getting better, but they're also getting worse. You know? What's the way forward if we're looking at domestic politics, depending on your politics, or European politics? If you're looking at the UK, if you're looking at Austria, if you're looking at France and Austria, where you have seen as liberal progressive governments swinging to the right when it comes to Muslims and their rights within their societies. One of my researches was one of, I forget now, 50 or 80 families in Austria in a 900 police and security person raid in the middle of the night. Everything seized, being accused of whatever, assets frozen, bank account, etc., etc. They still haven't been found guilty of anything. But that kind of thing could happen in Vienna. You know, let alone some of the other things that we see. So, okay, we all have a role to play. People of all faiths and of no faith. Democrats and Republicans and independents. I almost left out the independents, so I had to write that in. We bringing to bear our cherished American principles and values concerning freedom of religion, religious pluralism, and civil liberties. An observation to be made from the document called Common Word, which was put together by 130 originally Muslim leaders internationally, and that ballooned up and responded to by about as many Christian scholars, you know, etc. And in there, what they said was that in fact Islam and Christianity are far and away the two largest global religions. An estimated 1.97 billion Muslims. They didn't say this, I got the latest numbers now, okay? And 2.56 billion adherents, Christian adherents. And so they basically say Christians and Muslims are this predominant number in the world, and in a world that faces global catastrophe. And so basically said we have to work together. And the basis for that, even though they were talking about Islam and Christianity, they included Judaism in the statement that they were saying, is the basis is that we have love of God and love of neighbor. Now those notions are to be found in other religious traditions, but not in those words. But that recognition that we have this population of people that come out of traditions that basically say, if you really think about it, the idea that to be a good Muslim or Christian or Jew, it has to be love of God and love of neighbor. I've known, I can't believe I'm saying this either. I've known my wife and I would be like, you know, be in church and it would say, you know, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive others who have, and I lean over to her and I'll often give her two names and say, it's not going to happen now. I'm not ready. I'm just not ready. And it's still a problem. But anyway, that's this other side of my spiritual life. Okay, so what we need to do, it seems to me, is more and more talk about the importance of coexistence. And we need to see what this means in terms of as we go forward. Now, although I focused, and this is the end, only 3 paragraphs, stay awake. Although I focused on America, I'd be remiss if I did not mention that both Islamophobia and anti-Semitism have increased not only in America, but internationally, and at times exponentially. CNN did a major poll called A Shadow Over Europe, in which it reports anti-Semitic stereotypes are alive and well in Europe, while the memory of the Holocaust is starting to fade. This is still part of the quote. More than a quarter of Europeans polled believe Jews have too much influence in business and finance. Nearly 1 in 4 said Jews have too much influence in conflict and wars across the world. 1 in 5 said they have too much influence in the media, and the same number believe they have too much influence in politics. Global Islamophobia exists now across the world. The major places to see it is China, where you have genocide, Myanmar, former Burma, where you have genocide, and today, shockingly, in India, which is celebrated as a secular democracy, but under Modi and the Hindutva approach, the approach is to say that India is a Hindu nation. And we've had major discrimination and violence against Muslims in India. If you want to see any data on this, go to bridge.georgetown.edu. I created a thing called the Bridge Initiative, Protecting Pluralism, Ending Islamophobia. We have 1.1 million followers on Facebook. You go to that site, bridge.georgetown.edu. You'll see all kinds of data on countries, on people, on events from the United States across. You know, you'll look at members of Congress, you'll see presidents and the people that surround them. So for me, the important thing to take away from this today is that you are blessed. You are blessed to have something like the Dialogue Institute here, and to have those institutes generated throughout Texas and in other places in the United States. And the extent to which you participate gives me enormous hope about the future. I'm not saying this to please anybody, although I liked your check, thank you. It's outstanding the kind of turnout you get, the numbers that you get, the diversity that you get. I'm in DC, and it's hard to pull this together. And the fact that the very way that you conducted the whole opening and the way you move through this, for many of you who've come to these meetings, you'll think this is normal. It's still not quite there, okay? I can remember when you could really see sometimes how nervous Muslim communities were when you would go and there would be the sense that they had to have the American flag and sing the Star Spangled Banner. Now, I have nothing against the American flag and the Star Spangled Banner, but it was, you know, missing the whole point, or the idea of interreligious dialogue. You know, many of you don't really have any sense that the way most of us were raised in my generation, and for a good generation after that, and yet another generation, was that you had your faith and other people had their faith. But it wasn't that you really came together. It wasn't that you came together and actually had prayers said, you know, or worked together in the way. So I'm delighted to be here. I'm glad to be here for the 20th anniversary. Invite me back for the 40th. I'll only be 102. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your insight, Dr. Esposito. That was beautiful. And I love that you're a man who cries. I'm Italian American and I know about the tears. I don't have a cousin Guido, but I have a father Vince.
I want to announce, I say this publicly, and I mean this. If you have a wedding or a funeral, I don't have to know you. I come free.
Free for weddings and funerals, we have it. Well, one of the places we need to build more peace islands is certainly in Washington, where you're from. But I think we've done a good job building some peace islands between Travis and Williamson County in recent years. And we failed to acknowledge our Williamson County Commissioner, Terry Cook. We don't want to do that. So Terry, please stand up and let us recognize you. We so appreciate you being here. Well, now we come to the part of our program where we're going to be enlightened and entertained by Whirling Dervish. And let me tell you just a little bit about your entertainment tonight. Anur Kasaburi received his bachelor's degree from Ege University with a degree in Turkish music and dance techniques. He has visited many European countries to perform and present Turkish culture. He has also served on the Folklore Music Youth Club's board for more than 6 years and is near Turkey. He has been living in Dallas, Texas since 2013, and besides his artistic career and projects, he is working as a software engineer. He obviously can use both sides of this coin, so please welcome Whirling Dervish.